All right, hi guys. Today we're going to start going through our neuroanatomy section. This is the section that is specifically focused on the anatomy and physiology and clinical anatomy of the brain itself. There are two parts to this lecture. So the brain is divided up into a few key regions: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the brainstem. We're going to start by talking about the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. It's the part of the brain that contains the most neural tissue. The cerebrum is this large superior or superficial portion of the brain that covers the majority of the top and lateral aspects of our brain. The cerebrum gets divided into two cerebral hemispheres. Hemi means half, so half of a sphere. So there's a left cerebral hemisphere, which I've circled right here, and then on the other side is a right cerebral hemisphere. The two, if you're looking at the brain from the outside, the two cerebral hemispheres are divided, separated from each other by a deep groove called the longitudinal fissure. So superiorly, if you're looking down at the brain, you see a deep groove or longitudinal fissure separating the two halves or hemispheres. If you were to go down to the bottom of the longitudinal fissure, right? So like this is the groove, right, that goes through right here. If you go down to the bottom of the longitudinal fissure, there's a band of white matter that connects the two hemispheres together. That is called the corpus callosum. So all of this superficial area of the cerebrum, all of this is gray matter, where we have a lot of neuron cell bodies. Deep to that in the brain is where we have white matter. White matter is where there's axons carrying signals, from one place to another. So here, the corpus callosum, you can see connecting the two hemispheres, or if you look at this top picture, this white area right here, that's the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum has the axons, white matter, going back and forth between the two cerebral hemispheres so that they can, talk to each other, communicate with each other. The corpus callosum is divided into the rostrum, which is the very, very, the very first front portion of it, then the genu, then the body, which is the major section, and then in the very, very back, there's like a little widened area called the splenium. Again, this is white matter, which has axons. The cerebral cortex itself is a highly folded structure. The reason that it's so highly folded is to increase surface area. Because it's folded like this, there's more surface area crammed into a small space. More area means more gray matter, which means we have more neurons present. Looking at these folds, all of the raised areas are called gyri. Gyri is plural, just one is a gyrus. So like each of these actual little sections of gray matter, right? Each of these little raised areas is a gyrus. The little shallow grooves are sulci. That's plural. Just one is a sulcus. So all of these like little crevices that you see are sulci. A really deep groove is a fissure. So there's a lot of sulci, and then there's a couple really large fissures. One we said was the longitudinal fissure that separates the two hemispheres. In the back of the brain, there's also a transverse fissure. The transverse fissure is right here at the back. It's this deep groove that separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. The cerebellum is this little region that's at the very back and bottom of the brain. When we talk about the two cerebral hemispheres, the left hemisphere and right hemisphere, sometimes you'll hear conversations about hemispherical dominance, right? So somebody will say, oh, I'm a left brain person, or oh, I'm a right brain person. Hemispherical dominance just refers to one hemisphere being more dominant, right? Being the principal hemisphere for certain functions. Particularly important is language, right? So like language skills are particularly important and are very commonly dominant on one side or the other. The talking hemisphere, right, the one that controls language, is the dominant hemisphere. This is usually a function of the left cerebral hemisphere. So in most people, the left hemisphere is the dominant hemisphere in terms of language. So because of this, for example, like left-sided lesions, right? Lesions in the left side of the brain are usually more serious. They're usually associated with, worse symptoms than right-sided, because most people have are dominant in the left side. Handedness, left-handed or right-handed, is not the same thing, right? Like whether you're left-handed or right-handed does not correlate to linguistic dominance. Instead, it deals with motor control. And in this case, with motor control, remember that the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, right? And the right side controls the left side of the body. So they're opposite. It's called hemispheric lateralization. Anyhow, so typically most people are right-handed, right? So they more frequently use their right hand. That would mean that the left cerebral hemisphere is dominant for motor control. So looking at the cerebrum from the outside, again, so this whole thing is the cerebrum. We said that the cerebrum is highly folded, and the little grooves are called sulci. The deep grooves are called fissures. We looked at the longitudinal fissure going between the cerebral hemispheres, and then in the back we said the transverse fissure separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. There are a few prominent sulci, so like shallow grooves that are very prominent, that divide the cerebrum up into lobes. So the cerebrum is divided up into lobes by some kind of long dominant grooves. The central sulcus is the longest uninterrupted sulcus that we have in the brain. It's approximately in the middle of the superior lateral surface of the brain, and it goes all the way across. So from the central sulcus goes all the way from here all the way across the cerebral hemisphere, and it goes on both sides. So it goes all the way from one side across to the other. And in a second, we'll see that that's going to separate the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. The lateral sulcus is there's one on each side. There's on the lateral side of the brain. So the lateral sulcus is right here. And that's going to separate the temporal lobe from the other lobes. The parieto-occipital sulcus, we'll see the lobes in a second. The parieto-occipital sulcus is between the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is in the very, very back here, and then the parietal lobe is in front of it, like right here. So the parieto-occipital sulcus is going somewhere along, like right in this area. The thing with it is it's very difficult to see from the outside of the brain. So I have another picture, you guys, on my PowerPoint. The picture, it's just one slide, but I've separated the slide so that we can see the picture bigger on the other, on the next slide. So we can't really see this parieto-occipital sulcus from the outside of the brain. However, when we look at the inside of the brain, not the inside, but like the medial surface of the brain, we're able to see that parieto-occipital sulcus. So what we're looking at in this picture here is we've separated the two cerebral hemispheres from each other. So like this right here is where the longitudinal fissure separates the two hemispheres. This right here, this is the corpus callosum, where the two hemispheres are actually interlinked and connected with each other. So we're looking at the medial surface of the brain, and you can see the parieto-occipital sulcus right here. It's this groove that separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. There is another kind of important sulcus that goes through the occipital lobe, and that's called the calcarine sulcus. The calcarine sulcus is this one here that's dividing the occipital lobe into kind of like top and bottom parts, again, on the medial surface. So we just saw the sulci, right, the grooves that are dividing the brain up, and we said that these sulci divide the cerebrum up into lobes. The major lobes that you can see from the outside of the cerebrum are these first four. The names should be very simple, very easy to remember, because they match the names of the regions of the head, and they match the names of the bones that are in the skull. In the very front of the brain, we have the frontal lobe. This goes from the central sulcus forward. Back behind the central sulcus, we get to the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe doesn't go all the way to the very back, but it's a pretty good section back behind the central sulcus. The occipital lobe is in the very, very back of the brain. It's behind the parieto-occipital sulcus, which again, you can't see from the outside of the cerebrum, but just kind of in general, the very, very back of the cerebrum is the occipital lobe. Finally, the temporal lobe on either side of the brain, underneath or below that lateral sulcus, you see, below the lateral sulcus, you see the temporal lobes. Again, your temporal bone is here on the side of the skull, so that makes sense. Deep to all of this, there's another kind of lobe called the insular lobe. Insula is an island. This is like an island of cortex. It's its own little insular lobe or insular cortex. Sometimes you'll hear it called insula. It's an area that's actually deep to the rest of the cerebrum. So the lateral sulcus, the little groove that's on the side of the cerebrum, if you were to kind of put your fingers in that lateral sulcus and separate it, you would see another little chunk of cerebrum underneath. That's the insula. Here you can see the lobes of the brain. So in front of the central sulcus is the frontal lobe. Then in orange, back behind the central sulcus is the parietal lobe. And then in the very back of the brain, the occipital lobe. Here on the side, right below the lateral sulcus is the temporal lobe. This is showing us the insula right here, where again, we've went into this lateral sulcus and pulled it apart so that we can see this little island of cortex underneath. The second picture here, same thing, showing us the lobes. One thing here, this motor cortex, somatosensory cortex, those are specific functional areas of the brain. The central sulcus is right here, right between that purple and yellow area. So in front of that is the frontal lobe, which means the motor cortex is in the frontal lobe. Behind it is the parietal lobe. So that means the somatosensory cortex is in the parietal lobe. Here you see auditory cortex. That's right beneath the lateral sulcus. So that means the auditory cortex is in the temporal lobe. We'll talk about the functional areas in a little bit. So there are some other sulci, some kind of smaller grooves or smaller sulci that divide the brain up into key gyri. So first we divide the brain up into lobes, and then each lobe gets further divided up into specific gyri, like specific little chunks of cortex. So in the frontal lobe, the precentral sulcus is the sulcus in front of the central sulcus. So for example, like this is the central sulcus. The next groove up is the precentral sulcus. Then we have the superior frontal sulcus and the inferior frontal sulcus. So those are going this way, superior and inferior. In the parietal lobe, we have a post-central sulcus. So again, the central was in the very beginning, in the very middle. Sorry, the middle is the central, and then right after that, the next groove is the post-central. In the occipital lobe, I already mentioned this, but the calcarine sulcus is on the medial surface of the occipital lobe. And the calcarine sulcus is kind of going like, it's right here. It goes like this to divide the occipital lobe up into a top and bottom portion. The key gyri, which again, gyri are like the actual mass of the brain, right? The actual like raised little portions of the brain. The key gyri, key regions can be named. And the reason this becomes important is because each area has its own function. So like, for example, the precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus is this first area right in front of the central sulcus. So the central sulcus is this groove, and then this raised area, this actual like bit of cortex right here is the precentral gyrus. That precentral gyrus is the motor cortex, the primary motor cortex. This is where all corticospinal and corticonuclear fibers begin. So like the neurons that are actually sending signals down to tell our muscles to contract, they're located there in that precentral gyrus. The other frontal gyri in front of that are kind of going in the other direction. They're going like from the top to the bottom. We have our superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyri. So superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyri. They're just like between the superior and inferior sulci or grooves. In the parietal lobe, the gyrus that we'll look at is the post-central gyrus. So the post-central gyrus is just this raised area that's right after the central sulcus. The post-central gyrus is the primary somatosensory cortex. So in front of the central sulcus is motor. Behind the central sulcus is somatosensory information. So like body senses, like touch, temperature, pressure, pain, etc. So all of our somatosensory information is relayed in to that post-central gyrus, where our primary somatosensory cortex is located. In the temporal lobe, right? So remember, the temporal lobe is on the side inferior to this lateral sulcus. We have a superior temporal gyrus, a middle temporal gyrus, and an inferior temporal gyrus, right? So just these raised portions here. The superior temporal gyrus is where auditory information is received, right? That's where the primary auditory cortex is. So information about hearing is sent in to that primary auditory cortex. There are also some gyri on the medial aspect of the brain, the medial surface of the brain. So again, this is like if you went in the longitudinal fissure, right, and kind of pulled the hemispheres apart, and you're looking at the inside medial surface of the cerebrum. So the central solstice, right, that's coming across the center of the brain, the central solstice, a small portion of it is seen medially. It actually goes into the fissure. Surrounding that area, surrounding the medial central solstice, is called the paracentral lobule, or lobule. The paracentral lobule is the medial aspect around the central solstice. It has some of the frontal lobe and some of the parietal lobe. So because it has both, right, it's got like in the frontal lobe part is the precentral gyrus, which is for motor. The parietal part is the postcentral gyrus, and that's for somatosensory information. So that paracentral lobule area in the very, very middle of the medial aspect, that has both sensory and motor functions. The cingulate gyrus is also important. So first off, the cingulate solstice is a groove that we see on the medial aspect of the cerebrum, kind of like in the central regions. And this cingulate gyrus is the part of cortex between the cingulate solstice and the corpus callosum. So remember, the corpus callosum is that like white matter that we saw curving across. Kind of just above that corpus callosum is the cingulate gyrus. This cingulate gyrus is connected or is a part of the limbic system. The limbic system is emotion, is what we kind of nickname the emotional brain. So it's involved in emotion and memory. Okay, so the cingulate gyrus is this little band of cortex on the medial aspect of the brain that's important for emotion. The calcarine solstice and parieto-occipital solstice, remember, are grooves that we saw on the medial aspect of the cerebrum back towards the back of the brain. The calcarine solstice goes back from the parieto-occipital solstice, and remember, it divides the inside of the occipital lobe in half, right? Like when we looked, like if this is the medial aspect of the brain, the parieto-occipital solstice was like this, and then in half, going back like this, was the the calcarine, the calcarine solstice. The cuneus is between both of these two solstices. So the cuneus is the area like above the calcarine, like up here is the cuneus. The area in front of the cuneus is referred to as precuneus. We'll talk about those areas a little bit later when we talk about functions. Okay, so here we can see this. We're looking at the medial aspect of the cerebrum. So first off, this yellow line right here, going like this, that's the cingulate gyrus. That's the cingulate solstice, which means the raised area right below it, this raised area that's between the corpus callosum and that cingulate solstice, that's the cingulate gyrus. Right? The cingulate gyrus, we said, is part of the limbic system. It's important for emotion and memory. Emotion's the big guy there. Up top, this is where there's a little bit of the central solstice, just a tiny bit of central solstice that goes medially. And then around it was the paracentral lobule. Again, in the front is motor, in the back is somatosensory. This here is showing us the structures that are in the back. We have this right here is the parieto-occipital solstice, separating the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. This here was the calcarine solstice. Remember, above that we said was the cuneus. So this region right here, this gyrus is the cuneus. The area in front of that was precuneus, so that's that area here. You can also see this other star is for the cingulate gyrus. When we look at the center of the brain, there are open areas. So the ventricles are the open areas within the brain that allow for the production and the circulation of cerebrospinal fluid. CSF is cerebrospinal fluid. Here you can see, so like the cerebrum is on the outside and the brain itself is on the outside. And then in blue, these are showing us the open spaces within the brain that get filled with CSF. This here is, you can see those open spaces just kind of blown up so that you can see the shape of them. The cavity of the cerebrum itself is the lateral ventricle. So each cerebral hemisphere has a lateral ventricle in it. Those are these kind of C-shaped ventricles here. So each hemisphere has a lateral ventricle, and the lateral ventricle stretches the way that it starts up in the frontal lobe and it goes through all of the lobes. So it starts in the frontal lobe, goes back through the parietal lobe, and then this bottom C part, it curves out so that it goes into the temporal lobe. And then this little point at the back, that goes back into the occipital lobe. So the lateral ventricle touches the inside of all of the lobes of the cerebrum. The kind of other ventricles go down through the other regions of the brain. So every region of the brain has some part of these open areas on the inside of it. So we have the lateral ventricles. There's 2 lateral ventricles. They are divided up into different regions, as you can see. The anterior region, which is this, or anteriorly is what we call the frontal horn. The frontal horn is the part that goes to the frontal lobe. Then the body or central part is the part that it curves back through the rest of the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. The posterior or occipital horn is this pointy part that goes back to the occipital lobe. And then the inferior or temporal horn is this bottom part here that curves out kind of laterally a little bit into the temporal lobe. From the lateral ventricles, the cerebrospinal fluid flows through a little hole and into a ventricle that's in the very middle of the brain. That little hole or passageway is called the interventricular foramen. So there's one on each side. It's like lateral ventricles, and then you go through the interventricular foramen into the center, and that central part is the third ventricle. The third ventricle is the cavity of the diencephalon. So the third ventricle is this area right here that I'm coloring in purple. Again, that's the cavity in the center of the diencephalon. It's right in between the left thalamus and the right thalamus. There's 2 lobes of the thalamus, and right between them is that third ventricle. Then the CSF goes through this like kind of long, thin passageway called the cerebral aqueduct. And after the cerebral aqueduct, it goes into our last ventricle, which I'm coloring in orange, and that's the 4th ventricle. The 4th ventricle is the ventricle of the brainstem and the cerebellum. The cerebral aqueduct kind of goes through the brainstem, through the superior regions of the brainstem, and then the 4th ventricle opens up, and it's located again between the brainstem and the cerebellum. So all regions of the brain have these interior chambers where cerebrospinal fluid flushes through the inner surfaces. Cerebrospinal fluid is actually produced in these chambers. Inside the ventricles, we have these little masses of capillaries called the choroid plexus. So fluid gets filtered out of the blood and across a membrane called the ependema. So the fluid goes from the blood across the ependema and then into these open space, into the ventricles. And then it is CSF or cerebrospinal fluid at that point. Here you can just see these open areas. This is the lateral ventricle right here. And then we go down through interventricular foramen, and there's like a little chamber here called the third ventricle. Then we go through the cerebral aqueduct and into the fourth ventricle. From there, the fluid goes down through the central canal of the spinal cord. Cerebrospinal fluid does also exit and come around the outsides of the brain and spinal cord as well. Here, the second picture is just showing you a view of the ventricles from the front. Again, you can see the lateral ventricles here on the sides. Also here, right, you can just see little tiny bits of it out there in the temporal lobe, down through the cerebral aqueduct and into the fourth ventricle. Okay, so really quick, before we get into like the actual functional areas of the brain, I want to mention like cortical representation for the motor and sensory areas in the brain. So what I mean by that is the motor area. The motor area is this precentral gyrus, where we have the neurons that are going to send commands out to our muscles to make them contract. When I'm talking about the sensory areas, I'm talking specifically about the post-central gyrus, which is where we have our primary somatosensory cortex. That's where we receive our information about, touch, pressure, temperature, pain on our body. For these areas, a specific part of the body, like motor commands that are going to a specific part of the body, originate at one specific part of the cortex. This position, if you look at this body right here, this shows you the part of the cortex that controls each part of the body. Or for sensory information, it's the opposite, right? So sensory information from the face, you can see comes into this lateral part of that gyrus. Information from the arms, you can see comes in here to this kind of top part of the gyrus. Here you can see the hand. Here you can see the thumb. So there's a specific part of the gyrus that receives somatosensory information from each part of the body. There's a specific part of the gyrus that sends motor commands to each part of the body. So the position of this person is showing you which part, controls which part of the brain controls which part of the body. Also, notice the size difference of like the different parts of the body on here. This is all very intentional. So like the trunk, right? Notice the trunk, even though the trunk is a big part of your body, it's a relatively tiny little part of the brain. Whereas the thumb, right? The thumb's a small part of your body, but the thumb takes up the same amount of space on the brain as the trunk, right? Because your thumb is very important. Movements of your thumb are very complex compared to movements of your trunk. So the face, right? For example, look how large the face is on here, with the lips being very, very big. Look at the tongue, right? The tongue is out here very, very lateral, and it's a very big part of this. So cortical representation is based on functional importance, not size. Okay, so the functionally important structures include things like the thumb, the tongue, the lips, because the hand in general, because these areas perform very complex movements, they need greater cortical representation than, large basic structures like the trunk or the lower limb. Okay, so We're going to talk about all of the functional areas of the brain, starting specifically with the motor areas, and then we'll get to the sensory areas. So the motor areas of the cerebrum are anterior to the central sulcus. And we separate it into two different motor areas. So if you look at this top picture, sorry, I moved the picture and the star got screwed up, so ignore the blue star. The central sulcus is right here. So anterior to that, we have our precentral gyrus. That's where the primary motor area is. Area and cortex, the same thing. So you could say primary motor cortex or primary motor area. The primary motor area is where the cell body of the upper motor neuron is, right? So the upper motor neuron is here in the primary motor area of the cerebrum, and it sends commands for movement down to the lower motor neuron. The lower motor neuron is down either in the brainstem or in the ventral horn, the anterior horn of the spinal cord, depending on what muscles it is that we're moving. So this is for voluntary movements. We're sending commands out to skeletal muscles. So the commands that tell our skeletal muscles to contract originate up in this primary motor cortex, which is in this precentral gyrus. Anterior to that, so just in front of the primary motor cortex, is an area called the premotor area. Premotor, right? Like before the motor area or anterior to the motor area. This could also be called the motor association area. And we'll see that for most of our sensory areas, there's a primary area and an association area. So same thing here for motor. There's a primary area and an association area. So this motor association area or premotor area is, let me change colors, is this area here just in front of the primary area. The premotor area is where we kind of plan our muscle contractions. So this is where we generate the programs for skilled motor activity and direct the activities of the primary motor area. So the overall point here is that, like, when we perform movements, it's very complicated. You have to have a lot of different muscles contract. They have to contract in the correct order with the correct amount of tension. And this takes a lot of planning and a lot of practice. So the premotor area comes up with the plan for contraction and gives that information to the primary motor area. The primary motor area actually sends the command out so that they can ultimately go to the muscles and tell them to contract. This premotor area has extensive connections with other parts of the brain to kind of help it plan the contractions. For example, the premotor area has connections with proprioception, as well as with like the visual areas, balance, because it needs to know, exactly where your body is in order to know what contractions need to occur. Also, a little bit later, when we look at the cerebellum, we'll see that the cerebellum is kind of involved in this as well. Okay, so continuing on with other functional areas. Before we get into the sensory areas, there are a couple kind of smaller areas here in the frontal lobe. The frontal eye field is starred right up here. The frontal eye field is important for scanning movements of the eye. So like the muscles that are responsible for your eye being able to nice, smoothly scan, like as you're reading a page, for example. As well as for the accommodation reflex, so for focusing. Broca's area, which is also called the motor speech area, that's right down here in orange. This is in the the inferior frontal gyrus. It's a really small area on the very bottom of the frontal gyrus. Typically, it's on the left side of the brain, just in the left cerebral hemisphere. This is an area that's used for expressive speech. So it's responsible for or helps with the muscle contractions that are involved with actually producing speech. Then we have a bunch of sensory areas that we'll talk about. When we talk about the sensory areas, again, for most senses, there's a primary area and an association area. The primary area is where we actually receive the information from receptors, or from the thalamus frequently. But it's where the data comes in. The raw data comes into the primary cortex. The association area is where we kind of make sense of that information. It's where we're able to kind of process that info and recognize what it means. So, for example, let's talk about the somatosensory areas. The primary sensory area or primary somatosensory area is this area back here in the post-central gyrus. This is where we receive sensations of pain, touch, temperature, pressure, proprioception. And remember, representation, cortical representation, is based on functional importance. So just like we saw with motor commands when we had like the body that was laying upside down across the cortex, and we saw that, you know, some of the really small areas of the body had really big cortical representation, because cortical representation is not based on size, it is based on importance. Also, the sensation comes from the contralateral side of the body. So sensations from the left side of the body are received and processed on the right side of the brain, and vice versa. The somatostatic association cortex or somatosensory association area is this area that is back behind the primary cortex. So the primary cortex is in the postcentral gyrus, and then back behind that is the association area. The association area is, again, where we bring about recognition of what it is that we're feeling. So for example, for like stereognosis, stereognosis is how you can recognize what something is by just touching it. So with your eyes closed, if you were to close your eyes and I were to put a cotton ball in your hand, you could probably feel that and tell me what it was without seeing it, just based on the feel. That's stereognosis. The actual sensations are going to go into the primary cortex, but it's the association area that's going to allow you to make sense of those sensations and know that that's a cotton ball that you're touching. Taste or gustation, the primary gustatory cortex, is represented in the very, like the lowermost part of this sensory area. So the primary sensory cortex, or primary somatosensory area, if you go down to the very, very bottom of that area, like right down here, that's where the gustatory cortex is, the primary gustatory cortex for taste. Note, there is not a gustatory association area. In a little bit, we'll see that taste and smell have a combined association area, which makes sense because think about how interrelated taste and smell are, right? If something smells bad, then you don't really want to eat it, right? You assume it's going to taste bad. Taste and smell are processed and comprehended together because their association areas are combined.